This week, longtime web cartoonist Brad Guigar is here to talk about how he made webcomics his day job, the challenges of promoting your work in a changing media environment, how making an erotic comic forced him to up his game, and his new project to help not-safe-for-work comics creators support each other and find new readers. First, I'd like to thank our patrons for helping to keep the show going. You can join them by going to patreon.com/deconcomics and pledging a small monthly donation. At $4 a month, you can hear our monthly podcast on Batman comics from the 50s and 60s, and our archived shows on Jim Starlin's Captain Marvel run and the first 50 issues of Amazing Spider-Man. Or if you'd rather give a one-time donation, you can do so via PayPal by sending it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo. All right, I'm now talking with Brad Guigar in Philadelphia. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Okay, yeah. You said it's cold there. It's kind of cold in Tokyo too. It's been
that's right. You're in Tokyo,
yeah,
so you're in a completely different time zone, right?
Right. It's 7 a.m. here. Yeah. It's what 4 or 5 o'clock for you?
Yeah. It's just the day is just ending. Yours is just starting up.
And yeah, it's about 32 degrees here, Fahrenheit. Wow. So got up early, went out jogging before doing this. I haven't eaten breakfast yet, but
really? Wow. It's so weird for me to hear that, at 5 o'clock in the evening, that you're getting ready for breakfast. I never get my head around that. How long have you been in Tokyo?
Going on 36 years.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, I a lot of what I've read says that it like the community there kind of takes a long time to warm up. Are you kind of accepted as one of the crew, one of the gang by your neighborhood, or is it still a little bit of a barrier there?
Well, I don't feel like anyone's against me, but I guess if you're like out in the country, there can be a little bit more kind of foreigners type of feeling.
Right,
but
right.
I don't know. I don't sense anyone having a problem with me being here.
Your Japanese must be amazing.
Reasonably good. Yeah.
That's a big part of it too. Is the language?
I imagine so. Yeah.
Communicate. Yeah.
If I came in like some brash American yelling like in English, "Why don't you help me with this?" then it's more of a problem. But
yeah, I can imagine that gets shut down really quickly. God, I'm jealous. It sounds wonderful, especially to be in the midst of the comics scene over there. I visited one time for 2 weeks, and I was just agog at the amount of comics that I saw people reading, either in those big Shonen Jump, phone book size compilations, or people just reading comics and manga on their phones.
Yeah. Every
place we went, it's just a wonderful place for comics.
Yeah.
Gosh, I'm jealous.
So, Brad reached out to me. I've actually known your name since the Webcomics Weekly days.
Wow. You go way back.
So that's like, 15 years ago at this point?
Yeah. Yeah, Webcomics Weekly goes back to the How to Make Webcomics book, which was around 2007.
Yikes.
And when Scott Kurtz and Chris Straub, Dave Kellett, and I wrote that book together, we decided to do a podcast to kind of promote the book. So that was right around 2007, which was my kind of introduction to podcasting. And it went for about 80 some episodes before it kind of petered out. My one bit of advice to people for podcasting is never put a word like weekly in your title.
I know you got razzed for that constantly because your schedule was so irregular. After a while.
Especially at the end. It was by the time we got to like episode 80, we were all so busy with our own careers that getting the four of us to get together in front of microphones just became impossible. We couldn't do it. So then we'd have these shows where we'd have two of us or three of us. And pretty soon it was just kind of like, okay, what are we doing here?
I seem to recall the last gasp was that somebody did a Patreon or something, Kickstarter, and so you promised that if you made your goal, you'd put out X number of episodes, and you did, and then that was the end.
That was me. So when we did How to Make Webcomics, there was no social media to speak of. In fact, I don't think there's a single word about social media in that book. And so a few years later, I got the idea. I wanted to do kind of a spiritual cousin to that book. And no one was going to be able to write it. So I decided I was going to write it on my own and took that 200-page book and kind of reimagined it as a 300-page book, put a whole bunch of more content into it, and also addressing things like social media that was not around. A little bit of crowdfunding because Kickstarter was around, obviously, at that point. So as one of the rewards for that, I got all the guys to come around and do some episodes again. It was great fun. In fact, one of those episodes back was when Chris was just about, I think his wife was pregnant with their son. And Dave and I sat him down and gave him the dad chat about, kind of how to be a dad and what to expect and how people are going to tell you it's a horrible thing, but there's a lot of joy in fatherhood that you can let get drained out of you by these guys. And it's still to this day one of my favorite episodes is us kind of having this talk about fatherhood on that show.
Right. For people who aren't familiar, I mean, when Webcomics Weekly started, I think were you still doing Greystone Inn?
Yes. I was just, in fact, it was just, I just brought Greystone to an end because that would have been 2005. Okay. And I started Evil Inc., which was kind of a spin-off. Greystone Inn, again, just the worst concept. I loved it, but I couldn't make anyone love it as much as I loved it. It was a comic strip about a comic strip starring a gargoyle. And there was, as you can tell already, it was a hat on a hat on a hat. I couldn't make the pitch at comic conventions. And finally, one day after sitting at Toronto Comic-Con watching tumbleweeds go in front of my booth, I decided, this isn't working. I've been doing it for 5 years. This is not working. But one of the storylines that I had in Greystone was about a corporation for supervillains. And that really got a lot of attention. That got a lot of good feedback. And I'm like, I'm going to take that one storyline about villains who create a corporation, and I'm going to launch that as a title and see what happens. And that's how Evil Inc., the comic strip, started out way back in 2005. So by the time I came across your radar, I was probably about 2 years into that.
Okay. I remember Greystone Inn coming up in the discussions, but yeah. Okay. So were you big on drawing as a kid? Were you making comics?
Listen, Tim, this was the only thing I ever wanted to do with my life. I mean, for the time that I was a skinny little 8-year-old kid, and my parents gave me How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way right around 1977. This was the only thing I ever wanted to do. It had different permutations. For a while, it was comic book artist, but then I looked at what was on my page, and I looked at what was in the pages of How to Make Webcomics, and I'm like, I don't think I'm getting this. I don't think I'm getting there. So for a while, it was comic book artist. Then it was newspaper comic strip. I was a really big fan of Burke Breathen's Bloom County. Like everybody, I loved Calvin and Hobbes. And all of those newspaper strips really appealed to me. The idea of being able to do something humorous in 5 panels really, really appealed to me. For a while, when I got into high school, it was political cartoons. I actually was a political cartoonist for a while. But I quickly found out, even in the 80s, when I was doing political cartoons in Ohio, I just didn't have the heart for the animosity and the vile, bitter anger that would arise over having an opinion on politics. There's people who are good at it and people who have that kind of personality. I just wasn't it.
Mm-hmm.
So eventually I came back around to newspaper comic strips, and that's really after amassing a ton of rejection letters from the newspaper syndicates. When the internet crested in the late 90s and early 2000s, I was like, oh, wait a minute. I don't need any of these people. I can put my whole supervillain plot was to launch a comic strip on the web and build a huge audience, make those newspaper syndicates sorry that they had ever sent me a rejection slip, and force them to hire me. And of course,
so revenge motive.
That never, I've had a 25-year,
I'll show them.
A 25-year career completely powered by spite. Just nothing but spite. And of course, by that time, newspapers had already started declining and just having a terrible time. And there was a time, right around 2007, 2008, that we were like, we don't need any of this. We can do this ourselves. We can be publishers. We can do all of this stuff. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
I see. Yeah. Well, I mean, even if somebody wanted to, is there even a way to get a new strip in the paper anymore? It seems like it's dominated by like reruns and rebooted strips and stuff.
One of our Comic Lab backers, D, has a strip that had just got into newspapers, but you don't hear about them launching new comics very often. No. It's now it's once in a blue moon. They had one last gasp there. I think Tahid Bandia, his Crabgrass comic was kind of one of the last ones. Wallace the Brave, also by Will Henry. There was a little bit of a last gasp there, but I think those folks are holding on with white knuckles, just trying to hold out as long as they can. But no, the whole concept of newspaper comic strips is just it's all but decimated. And you're right. If you open up a newspaper page to the comics, you're going to see legacy strips, reruns, strips that are done by children and grandchildren of the original people. It's just there's nothing happening there. It's kind of sad because, like I said, that was one of my first loves. But there's nothing happening.
Sure, yeah. In the 20th century, that was a big thing, especially like earlier on, like when Lil Abner actually like brought certain expressions into English because enough people read it.
Well, I don't know if you've ever seen a movie called How to Marry a Millionaire. I think I'm getting that title right. Or no, it was either that or How to Kill Your Husband. It was one of those. It was a Jack Lemmon movie. But in this movie, Jack Lemmon plays a cartoonist, and he plays it during that heyday period. He's got a butler. He lives in a mansion. It's I don't know whether you can see around here. There's no mansion happening over here in Philadelphia. But yeah, it was a very different time. Newspapers were a dominant media, and if you had that ability to do something amazing in a small number of panels, you could really become quite wealthy.
Yeah, for sure. Just ask Charles Schultz.
Yeah, exactly.
So now, are comics? That's like your main job nowadays?
Yep.
Yeah.
I've been a full-time cartoonist for 10 years now, for a good period of time. So, in fact, this has a comics background, too. When I was in college, all of my work were comics and cartoons, and they brought in Bill Day. At the time, he was the editorial cartoonist for the Detroit Free Press. And they brought him in to jury my show at college, which was cool. And he was very kind, took lots of time with me, and we took him out to dinner that night. And I'm like, hey, give me advice. At that time, I wanted to be a political cartoonist. I said, give me advice. Tell me how I do what you do. And he says, I got bad news for you. There's about 150 jobs in political comics, and they're all filled. And we're all waiting for somebody at one of the good newspapers to die. And then we all move up one, and we leave an opening at the bottom of one of the crummy newspapers, and you and 1,000 people just like you all compete for that job. And I said, that doesn't sound great at all. He said,
No.
it's not. But he says, here's what you do. He says, go and get a job at a newspaper in the editorial side, not the advertising side. Go get into the newsroom as a graphic artist. You've got all the skills. You can do that. Desktop publishing. This was in early 90s. Desktop publishing was just starting to crest. Macintosh computers were just landing. And he says, you've got all of those skills. Get a job in the newsroom as a graphic artist, and then submit political cartoons on the side. They'll love somebody who can do local cartoons, and you'll build your portfolio. And so that advice started a 20-year career in newspapers doing exactly that. So I worked in Canton at the Repository, moved to the Akron Beacon Journal, and then got kind of headhunted by the Philadelphia Daily News. They brought me out here, and I worked here for 12 years before finally the death of the newspaper industry had settled. And basically they were, it was kind of like, now you can take a buyout or you can get fired. You can choose which. And I took the buyout in 2012 and had a tough couple of years there making the transition, but I've been a full-time cartoonist ever since.
Okay. Yeah, I know in the Philadelphia paper you were doing something called Fables with a PH.
Yes, you remember. Boy, you've done your homework. You got deep roots. So Fables, yeah, that was such a great, that was nominated for an Eisner Award back in the day. Fables was, they gave me Philadelphia Daily News was a tabloid style newspaper. It wasn't like a supermarket tabloid, but that was the size and shape of it. So they gave me a full page every Monday, and I did stories about life in Philadelphia. And I shared some of my stories. Then at the end, I would say, hey, do you have a story about living in Philly? Tell me what it is, and I'll make it into a comic. So then people would write in with their own stories. Some of them were just gangbusters. And I would take that story, do a little interview with them, get some of the details, and make a full-page comic out of that. And at the end, as this thing progressed, it became this ongoing conversation about what life was like in Philadelphia from the perspective of a whole bunch of different people in comic form. Yeah, that was one of my all-time favorite projects that I worked on for them was Fables.
Okay. So you're a full-time cartoonist, and a lot of other like part-time cartoonists are wondering how you managed to do it. And of course, you've done a lot of discussion of that in your podcasts and books. But briefly, what would you tell somebody about trying to get into it full-time?
Well, I would tell them that it took me every bit of 12 years to get to the point where I could even think about it. That's the one thing that's hard to convey to people is that what you have to remember is that especially in the time that I started when the web and web publishing was dominated by advertising. So I had comic strips at that point. If you look at the early web comics, I like Keen Spot and Modern Tales and all of those pseudo syndicates. They're all dominated by newspaper style comic strips, 3 and 4 panels. The reason for that is again, in a pre-social media enterprise driven by ads, we had to do something that we could update every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The good ones did Saturday. Some of them did Sunday because we had no way of keeping in touch with our readers. There was no social media. So if you found somebody, hopefully they bookmarked you on their browser, or they had this thing called RSS, which I still miss to this day. And you had to keep them coming back, and you had to make yourself a part of like their morning routine, or else they'd forget about you. So in order for me to build my audience to the point where I could finally make a transition into full-time comics, it took me 12 years of daily newspaper comic strips, 5 days a week, month after year after year after year with very little breaks, if any. In fact, for the first decade or so, there were no breaks. I had a comic up there Monday through Friday, no matter what. I had to do that, number one, because of everything I said. Also, with an ad revenue website, having more pages meant more opportunities to display ads, meant more money. And I had, along the way of doing all of that, I built an audience. It took me 12 years of daily work, a new comic every day. But I had built my audience to the extent that I could reasonably assume that they could support the things that I was doing, either through crowdfunding, which was just starting. We're talking 2012. Not a lot of people are talking Patreon in 2012. Kickstarter was definitely there, and I had built that strongly into my business plan. But at that point, the web was still advertising. But yeah, it took me 12 years. And then, just to give your listeners another history lesson, what happened in 2013 was a new piece of technology came out. It was called an ad blocker. And all of a sudden, you remember, all of a sudden, all of my ad revenue, which at one point I was using to pay my mortgage, I couldn't pay the electric bill with it.
Wow.
Because it just dwindled down to nothing. So then we had to turn real strongly into crowdfunding. And by that point, you see a lot of web cartoonists, including me, turning to Patreon and saying, okay, what can I do for an exclusive that people will be interested in joining my Patreon to see? And also, what can I get out on Kickstarter immediately to bring some of that money in?
I see. Yeah. So nowadays, of course, everybody's publicizing stuff on social media, but I think it's not as easy as people think to put stuff that people are going to notice on social media. Yeah. So what's your strategy for that?
Social media is a whole nother thing, and asking me or anyone in late 2024 what their social media strategy is really dicey, because starting in around 2023, social media in general has started on a real noticeable decline. Okay. Starting around when Elon Musk took over Twitter and made a whole bunch of changes to that platform, Twitter was a web cartoonist's dream, because you could have a link in your tweet, unlike Instagram, which doesn't allow outgoing links at all, or Facebook, which allows them, but then really throttles your post if you have the unmitigated temerity to put a link in your post. Twitter at that time maybe gave you a little bit of a nudge down on the algorithm, but not so much that you couldn't get stuff done. And at one point, if I was doing a Kickstarter back in those days, when I was looking at my stats later, I saw that Twitter had delivered maybe 30 or 40% of my pledges. So Twitter was a dream for people like me. And when Musk took over the platform and changed it, I could see in real time, in the next subsequent Kickstarters and in other things where I was able to track the efficacy of my tweets, I could see them just diminishing. So we had a whole period of time in 2023 and 2024 of all the social medias really kind of bottoming out. Then you remember Threads came up, and for 2 weeks, Threads was the answer to everyone's prayers, right? That was going to be the Twitter killer. Everything's great. We were dancing out in the streets. Thread is here. Fantastic. And then something interesting happened where 2 weeks, boom, all the air got let out of the balloon. And I think my own personal theory is that people kind of realized that they were starting to get a little bit over social media, because we had the perfect replacement for Twitter in almost every way. And I think people, and I'm talking like everyday people, not creators or people who are trying to use social media to do business like you and me, but instead, I'm talking about everyday people. They were like, yeah, I'm here. I just don't like it anymore. It's not the same. They're over it. So we had a big period of time where that happened, and I launched a Kickstarter in the middle of all that. And I'm telling you, Tim, I could go back and look at my my analytics. Twitter didn't deliver anything. Like maybe 1% of my last Kickstarter was Twitter. Instagram, 0. And in fact, my podcast partner, Dave Kellett, he had 45,000 followers on Instagram. His last Kickstarter, same thing. 0 from Instagram. Facebook, same thing, just under delivering. And so we're all looking, same thing, same kind of situation as 2013 when the ad blockers came. All of a sudden, everybody looks for answers. What's this guy doing over here? Hey, maybe that's working. What's this guy doing? And 2 things came up that really stood out. And one of them was Substack, and the other one was Blue Sky. Substack came out, and Substack kind of took a reimagining of the newsletter idea, but then paired it with some social media features. And people were saying for a long time, Brad, you got to check out Substack. You got to check out Substack. And I was like, nah, I've already got a MailChimp. I don't need this shit. And finally, it's like, okay, I got to try something because everything else is flattening out. And Substack offered me amazing, jaw-dropping growth in a very quick time. But once I started doing just some common sense things in my publishing that I was able to pick up on very quickly. And so Substack was one. And Blue Sky, and this is just saying over the last 4 months since with you and I talking here, Blue Sky all of a sudden came out of nowhere and started really, when things started happening around November and such, particularly, we saw a big exodus. Blue Sky, I think, leaned into that a little bit. And right now, you're not only with engagement, which is like, reminds me of 2010 engagement on Twitter, like really great engagement. And Blue Sky came through with those starter packs. Do you know what I'm talking about with those things?
Starter packs.
So Blue Sky had this brilliant idea. It's called a starter pack. Now, what you do is you say, here's a webcomics starter pack, and you add up to 150 Blue Sky accounts of webcomics artists. And then you put that out to people, say, hey, if you're looking for webcomic artists to follow, here's my starter pack. Now, they can select the ones they want to follow, or they can hit a big blue button at the top that says follow all. These starter packs have resulted in exponential growth among people like us who are comics creators and others. Romance authors I know are using this big time. Starter packs in and of themselves have resulted in huge follower growth on Blue Sky. So when I see stuff like that between Substack and Blue Sky, big time engagement and growth, that's where all of my energies as a publisher have gone into. I actually took the time to erase every single tweet after they were announced that they were, going to start training their AI on it. I'm like, nah, not going to. I don't want any of that. So there was a guy that made a script, and you plugged it in, and it went through. It took 2 hours, because I've been on it for 15 years. 2 hours it took to delete all this stuff.
And there's no select all button, right? It's
one. They do not make it easy. They don't make it easy. But Twitter, I deleted everything. Instagram, same thing. That one I actually did manually. They pissed me off so much. I'm like, nah. I sat there clicking buttons for an hour and a half just because they made me so mad.
I've never understood Instagram. But
no, you and me both. Listen, it was the easiest. Twitter was a hard decision for me to make. Instagram, easy. I never got a single thing out of Instagram.
I've never even put this podcast on Instagram because you can't put a link and...
Yeah, so what are we doing here, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so right now, and it hit me. I'm all but done on Facebook. In fact, I still have a couple of fan pages. Problem is, like, they deliver so little in terms of engagement. I keep forgetting to post there, so they're still there. I kind of owe those people a little something. I got to do something. I keep telling, come on over to Substack. Come on over to Substack. We're having fun over there. But out of my social media, I've all but stopped on Facebook. Instagram is dead. Twitter, dead. I deleted my entire footprint. Threads, I haven't posted there in months. And when just as somebody who's been on doing web publishing for as long as I have, telling somebody out loud that I'm not using Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram is like the Twilight Zone for me. You know, it's like I can't believe the words come out of my mouth.
Well, yeah, this stuff changes quickly online. Yeah, so
it really does. It really does.
Now, I mean, so people like you and Dave and whoever are making your living doing comics online, but I don't know that any webcomic has become as popular as the old-timey strips in the newspapers were. No. Like, there's no Peanuts out there.
No. And that's never going to happen because you could only have that with a homogenous media environment like newspapers were. I mean, when you think about it, it was a perfect captive audience. If you subscribed to the Seattle Times, you got exposed to those comics on the funny pages, whether you wanted them or not. You got exposed to them over and over and over and over again for years and years and years. And so that created a system where you could have like a Charles Schulz, who was a multimillionaire by the time that he was at the end of his career, or a Jim Davis, same thing. Burke Breathed, I think, did very well. So did Bill Watterson. But those days are never coming back. Instead, here's the trade-off out of all of that, Tim, is that you're not going to have somebody that is a household name like Jim Davis. But you are going to have a whole lot more opportunities for a lot of those voices that had been marginalized previously, a lot of people that didn't make it through the gatekeepers earlier. And you're going to have it possible for a creator like that to make a very good living, to make a very good financially stable business with a much, much, much smaller audience, right? They can, and that's the trade-off, is that, like, my audience is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of Charles Schulz's audience, but I've been able to build a very good financially stable business on that fraction, because even though they're small, they're passionate about what I do, right? In fact, we say in Comic Lab all the time, you don't measure an audience by the person, you measure by the passion. Dave Kellett's another great example. His comic Drive is a science fiction. It's kind of like what if Dune was done by the Muppets, right? It's a science fiction comedy. And his audience for Drive is very, very small. But when you look at his Kickstarters, those are 6-digit Kickstarters that he does. And an amazing audience for that. And the list goes on. A lot of voices that we wouldn't have heard, a lot of people that were kept on the sidelines by a newspaper comic system. Those folks have a much better chance at building financial stability with a much smaller audience. That's the trade-off.
Coming up, Brad's thoughts on how to promote your comic. Do you have to be on Webtoon and Tapas? Should you be? Also, the challenges of making an erotic comic and Brad's new project to help not-safe-for-work comics creators support each other. By the way, don't forget to check us out on Blue Sky. We're at Decon Comics.
Who's Who, the definitive podcast of the DC Universe.
Spanning from the first issue of Who's Who in 1985 all the way through the Loose Leaf edition.
Including all the updates, the spin-offs, custom Who's Who pages for forgotten characters, and tons of in-depth character spotlights.
Entries span from the golden age of DC
and into the extreme 1990s.
Covering characters such as Superman by Kurt Swan and John Byrne.
The Justice League by Kevin Maguire.
Batman by Dick Giordano.
The New Titans by Tom Grummett.
Wonder Woman by George Perez.
The Legion of Superheroes by Keith Giffen.
The Flash by Carmine Infantino.
Lobo by Simon Bisley.
The All-Star Squadron by Jerry Ordway.
Firestorm by Al Milgrom.
Aquaman by Chuck Patton.
So many entries talking about Ian Karkull.
The Forever People again, and again, and again.
And hundreds of other characters found in Who's Who, the definitive podcast of the DC Universe.
Available wherever you find podcasts and at fireandwaterpodcast.com.
Nuclear Man, Batman, Hawkman, 2D Man, and Hour Man. Who are all these people, man? They're all part of the DC Who's Who.
Many years ago, I was doing a webcomic myself, and then when I got into podcasting, I ran out of time to work on my comic.
Tale as old as time.
But it was pre-social media. MySpace was there, but it was before anybody was on Facebook. And so I had my own website for it, which I was crazy. I was doing it hard-coded.
Oh, yeah, you were crazy. Yeah, you were. Well, let's not say crazy. Let's say you were dedicated. You were dedicated.
Yeah, okay. All right, I'll take that.
Also crazy.
And of course, nowadays, well, maybe to some extent there were then too, but I don't know if there were at that time like websites that people were putting their comics on. I mean, there were like sites where you could vote on like which comics you liked, and there was like a ranking, and I was listed in there like way down at the bottom.
Yep.
But so nowadays there's stuff like Webtoon or Tapas, and so what's the best way, do you think, to get your comic available so it gets in front of some eyeballs?
That's a great question, especially because there's in doing our podcast, Comic Lab, we hear from younger people particularly who are like, I've got to be on Webtoons because it's the only place to find comics readers, right? And we hear this a lot, and the truth of the matter is that that's all bunk, and also. The first thing I say to somebody who feels that they need to be on Webtoons or they need to be on Tapas, which is another very similar comic network website thing, take a look at the front page of either one of those, and you will see a very, again, homogenous group of comics. You're going to see a whole lot of comics that are all drawn very similar style and have a very similar theme or a very similar storyline, okay? Which is perfectly valid. That's what's going to happen. You're going to build an audience that gravitates towards a certain type of storytelling.
Yeah,
and
it's kind of the same as newspapers 50 years ago.
Yeah. But the problem is that if you're a comic artist that doesn't do that comic, if you're not doing a romance manga, for example, you're not going to do well on Webtoons. If your stuff doesn't look like that, if your stuff doesn't read like that, there's a couple of outliers. I realize that, but by and large, you're not going to do well on Webtoons. And talking yourself into believing that that you've got to be there because that's where all the comics readers are. That's very limited thinking. And take it from somebody who's been around for 25 years. If I would have allowed myself to think like that, I would not. I'd have a day job right now. I'd have to. So here's what I want you to think about when it comes to publishing a comic in 2025. And that is, if you want to do Webtoons or Tapas, look at that terms of service very carefully. There are words in any contract that you sign that should give you cold feet, rightly so. Words like irrevocable, words like perpetuity. Okay? If you read that in any terms of service, my advice is to head for the hills. Okay? That's not a contract you want to sign. Okay, so what does that mean for somebody who wants to do this today? Own and control your own work. And that means, I know this is going to make me sound old, it means having a website. And I know everybody out there just turned off their podcast and says, the old man, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Here's the thing. when I put another Patreon person, when I onboard a new Patreon backer, I send them a 1-question questionnaire, and it says, how did you find out about my Patreon? 70% of the people who have answered that questionnaire over time said the Evil Inc. website. That is significant. So you're not going to just use your website. It's not going to be the only leg under your table, but you do need a website. Then you need to use social media to publish and promote. Publish in that I should be able to read your entire comic on your social media feed, not a link to it someplace else. And as much as I can, I want to be able to read that with as few steps as I can, with as few pinch and zooms as I can, right? I want to be able to read your stuff on social media. That's a big part of it as well. So it's not only promoting on social media, but you're using social media to publish. And then the third part right now is Substack, which is really, really a significant audience builder for me and for a lot of people that I'm talking to. And that is where I would point people, is that you want to build an audience that you can control. And if you're building an audience on somebody else's property, like Webtoon or Tapas or any place else, frankly, the audience that I'm building on Blue Sky, I can't completely control that audience. It's nice to have, but just like we saw on Twitter, one guy takes over, and that entire audience I spent 15 years on Twitter cultivating and maintaining was useless to me. So social media is good for what it is, but I always need a place where I can regroup, where I can post things the way I want them to be. Nobody can tell me what I can or cannot post on my website. To a certain extent, that's true on Substack too, right? But I want to be able to control that audience. I'm going to use social media to the extent that I can to build, but I'm always funneling those audience members into my Patreon, into my website. Those are the two main places that I really can control and build my audience, Patreon and my website. So I'm funneling into those places constantly with as many different outreaches as I can. Those main ones being Blue Sky and Substack. And Kickstarter. The more I go down the line, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but the more I go down the line, the more I'm realizing that Kickstarter is social media. And we're building audience there too. And every time I do a Kickstarter for a new book, I see and you know how in the middle you hit this flat period in the middle of your Kickstarter where you just want to die because nobody's pledging at all. And so what I do is I'll make an update on one of my previous Kickstarters. So let's just say for Evil Inc. Book 3, I went to Evil Inc. Book 1 and I posted an update on that Kickstarter for Evil Inc. Book 1 saying, hey, I'm doing a new book, and you know what? You'd probably enjoy it because you showed that you liked Evil Inc. once. Here, go check it out.
And then everybody gets an email.
Yes. And then all of a sudden, I get a whole bunch of new pledges. And then they stick around. And then when I do Evil Inc. Book 4, then I'm going to Book 3 and to Book 2 and to Book 1. And there's an audience building mechanism, and Kickstarter really delivers on discovery. They're fantastic. The more I do this, the more I realize that I've got to start thinking about social media. I've got to think about Kickstarter in itself as being a social media.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I wish I could figure out how to use Kickstarter for podcasting.
That's tough. That's tough because there's no, like, nobody wants a DVD of your podcast, right? Your best bet there is Patreon. Do you do a Patreon?
I'm doing Patreon, yeah.
Yeah, your best bet there is to have exclusive content there for your Patreon because nobody's going to want physical media, and Kickstarter really is all about physical media. Yeah. You're in a catch-22 there.
And I'm not sure if you are, but I know Dave has done a lot of like just merch, like stuffed animals and stuff. He's done in the past. He's done stuffed animals. He's done T-shirts. Right now, other than merchandise like enamel pins, he's leaned in heavily towards like stuff like enamel pins. He doesn't do the T-shirts and the stuffed animals as much. Couple of reasons: they're just bulky.
to store and to ship.
Yeah.
T-shirts are the worst because you always end up with like a few sizes that nobody wants that you can't move. They're very heavy to ship to comic conventions and stuff in bulk. And cumbersome. Stuffed animals get damaged very easily. Toys are the same way. So a lot of those merchandise options we've kind of shuffled away from. Although enamel pins over the last several years have been very, very good performers. Plus, and like Dave will still do one comic convention a year. I stopped in 2017. I got to the point where I'm like, I'm not making enough money to justify going to these comic conventions. It just isn't happening, right? I'd get into this situation where I'd go to one comic convention, and at one point in time, I was doing 12 a year. I'd go to one comic convention and make a few $1,000s. And then the next comic convention I'd go to and make zilch. And all my profits were going away. And when I actually added up all the money that I made at a convention and then subtracted what I spent on travel and hotel and booth fees and also just being away from the studio and not getting work done. 2017, I'm like, I'm calling a full stop to this. That was the first year my business truly took off in terms of the financials, was when I stopped doing comic conventions altogether. Dave was still
that was good because a few years later everything was shut down. So it wasn't a crisis for you.
I was not upset over that decision in the slightest. But in terms of the enamel pins, Dave still does Comic-Con International every year. And the pins are nice to have out on the table because they have a $5 thing. People can either add those to an order or they're going to be more apt to go up and nose through a $5 item than a $40
nice and compact
hardcover.
To ship there.
And they're easy as heck to ship. Yeah.
So one thing that was never welcomed by newspapers was erotic comics.
Yeah. No, funny how that worked out. They didn't like that.
So, I mean, obviously a lot of these non-safe for work comics have found an audience online. And you started doing one too that's kind of a spin-off from Evil Inc. And so explain that and what made you decide to do that?
So when around about the same time that Patreon was coming up and I was looking for an exclusive, right? Because that really is a big driver of Patreon, is something that you can put that's exclusive. You got to pay to see it. And all of my comics up until that point always had a good degree of like cheesecake to them. They had they had a good degree of sexual innuendo. They had a lot of double entendres.
I noticed that looking at Evil Inc. the other day.
There was always a certain degree of that that I kept in check because for a long time I still was harboring this idea of being a newspaper cartoonist. And so finally, when I let go of that and I let myself, like not only in terms of the story, the way it was drawn, but like I allowed my characters to use 4-letter words and to talk about more grown-up situations in a realistic sense. And I saw my storytelling take a big step up when that happened because I wasn't tiptoeing around the story the way I'd have to if I was in a newspaper, right? So that's always been a part of Evil Inc. was kind of like this this flirtation with sexuality. And so when I saw what Patreon had put together, I'm like, oh, I could do something that's very much adults only, and kind of I don't have to tiptoe around it anymore. And so I started thinking about different ways that I could kind of do things within the Evil Inc. universe, but was meant for an adult audience. And that's when Evil Inc. After Dark was born. And when again, talking about the audience that you cultivate, when I spent 12 years cultivating a certain audience with an expectation of a certain amount of sexual innuendo, when I said, okay, now here's the next step to that, they were kind of ready to go. They was like, okay, yeah, this is the next logical step. And so I saw that my audience was going to support it. My audience was going to be there for it. So I knew I had something there. And then I came upon the first real problem that I was going to face with doing Not Safe for Work comics is that, number one, my art skills had to improve exponentially, right? I had to become much better at anatomy. And also, just talking to your comics artists listening, think about how hard it is to draw two people dancing, just in a ballroom dance, right? Getting all of that anatomy to line up just right so that, they're holding hands and one person's got the arm around the other. Drawing a dance scene is difficult. This was that times 10 for me. This was a lot of art skills that I had to improve greatly as an artist. I couldn't get away with fudging things from a straight-on perspective or an isometric perspective. I had to become a much better artist if I wanted to do this. And that was only half the battle, because drawing a scene that involves sex, you've only got there's only so much you can do, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of repetitive, not for nothing. And what happens is you've got to become a better writer if you're going to write erotica, because it's no longer about, okay, these two people are in the bedroom, at 3 if it's a good scene. If you got to keep an audience coming back, they've got to care about why those people are in the audience. They've got to have a certain amount of buy-in. So at the same time I had to improve my artist skills, I had to become a better writer, because I just couldn't get away with, and then they had sex. That was not going to happen. No one was going to be interested in that. They had to know why they were in that room. They had to have that buy-in. Otherwise, I was going to lose audience very quickly. So that stuff, and not for nothing, the challenge of that, those two things that I just mentioned, made this an inescapable opportunity for me. I had to do it. I had to see if I could pull up my art skills. I had to see if I could write that well. And it's been the best challenge of my career. 25 years on, writing adult content has been a tremendous challenge, especially like I'm 10 years in now. I can't coast on certain things. There's no surprises. I've got to be a good writer to be able to do that. And it's been fantastic. I don't regret a bit.
I see. Well, I'm not just in that way, but it seems like in a lot of ways you can't coast, because the social media landscape keeps changing and the internet changes. And I think I tend to get in a habit of like, just put it here, put it there. And
that's easy. It's an easy habit to get into. And let's face it, everybody, you and me, everybody listening, we've got other things going on in our lives. So at some point, it's like, oh my God, just tell me what to do. Just tell me where to post it. Tell me where to put this damn thing.
What's the recipe to get 1 million listeners?
Yeah. It's not easy.
So the reason that you contacted me initially was that you've got a project started to support erotic comics creators. So tell us about that.
So I'm super excited about this. Spice Rack Comics. We launched it earlier in December, and by the way, this is kind of a natural progression out of everything that we just got done talking about, because as we're coming in, as we were starting 2024 at the beginning of the year, Dave and I were doing a comic lab where we were talking about our goals for 2024, and I said, I can see where social media is really, falling down. It's deflating. We're not getting what we used to get. And it's also getting harder and harder for Not Safe for Work comics to publish. Patreon has been really good about their commitment to Not Safe for Work content. But I've seen other platforms like Tumblr and Gumroad completely do great with NSFW and then abandon them. And so it's like I've got to start getting a little bit proactive here about how I'm going to publish, because it's getting harder and harder to put my content across because of censorship or content moderation on certain platforms. I've got to be proactive. So I talked about bringing back an idea that had been lost to Web 1.0 when we first started out in 2000, 2001. I said we had this thing called a web ring. Right? You remember web rings?
Yeah. I was in one myself. Yeah.
It was a great concept. You had on your website, you had a little promo box on the bottom, and it basically said, hey, if you like this website, you're going to like the next one. And then you click a link and it took you to the next one. On that website, they had the same thing. And they said, if you like this one, you'll like the third one. And you click on that, you'd go to the third one. And the idea was eventually you'd come all the way around to the first one. And it was a way of cross promotion, and it was a way of audience sharing. And it worked. They were really powerful. And I'm like, as we're seeing social media decline, we're going to have to start thinking about some of those old tricks we did in the early 2000s that and it all comes back to things that like we did without thinking twice about it in the early 2000s. Cross promotion, networking, audience sharing, that kind of stuff. So I started thinking about how I could do that. And I reached out to a guy that I knew from way back. His name is Matt Sowers. And I said, hey, I knew he did web development. I said, could you code this? Could you code something that was basically ostensibly an ad, but then we could schedule it? And if I had a dozen not safe for work comic creators who had their own websites, you had to have your own website, that we could start sharing audience among them and bring people around. And he says, oh yeah, I can do that. Well, that started in January of 2024. And then it was perfecting it, crafting it, bringing some people in, selling them on the idea. It wasn't until December we were finally ready. It took an entire year to put this thing together. But in December, we pulled the switch and we launched Spice Rack Comics. I've heard some pretty encouraging news about the first. Basically, you're in the promo box for an entire week, and we've had we're starting our third week right now. And the two people who've been through have been reporting some really encouraging things about how the web ring is working. And also at the same time, because I loved what I'm seeing on Blue Sky, we launched a Spike Rack Comics Blue Sky account. And that one, just over the last 7 days, we've doubled our follower count. And with those starter packs and with some other audience building activities we've done, some events that we've hosted, we've seen some good stuff there. So the whole thing I'm trying to do with Spice Rack in general is I want to, the number one, help not safe for work comics creators find a way to navigate some of the censorship, the content moderation, the discoverability problems that we have, and particularly with that central crew that I've built, but also with the wider NSFW comics community in general. I want to start building a place where we can have a conversation, we can build collaborations, we can extend our network. Just in the last 2 weeks, I've discovered so many people doing so many amazing, not safe for work, and a whole gamut. There's a whole spectrum of comics we're talking about here. People doing just amazing things in not safe for work comics, and I'd never heard of them until now. So it's been really kind of an exciting time. I can't tell you how jazzed I am about the idea of bringing the web ring idea back. Yeah. And then as we built this group together, it's not quite a collective like in the old days in the idea of a comics collective where everybody is kind of like under one business umbrella. But we've already started talking about some events and some other projects that the group of us can do together out in the wider world that we can use to cross promote. And it goes back to those early days of webcomics where if Chris Crosby brought in one person to webcomics who was his reader, I was overjoyed because that meant that person was now predisposed to maybe someday being my reader, right? And we're going back to that, where we're literally doing audience sharing and cross-promotion. And again, those concepts that we after social media became big, we stopped thinking about it. Nobody thought about cross-promotion. I do a thing where I do a Patreon content exchange. I'll find another creator who's doing a similar kind of not safe for work comic that I'm doing. And I get in touch with them and I say, I got this thing. I'm going to do a sampler pack of my comics, 24 pages. I'm going to send it to you. You give that to your not safe for work level backers as a surprise bonus reward today or, on a certain day. You do the same thing. Give me a sampler pack of your stuff. And then I'll share that with my audience. Basic cross-promotion. Nobody does it anymore because nobody thinks about it. That basic cross-promotion, what happens time and time again, and I've got to talk people through it because they're like, oh, no, you're trying to steal my patrons. And I'm like, no, trust me. Look at the numbers on this. What's going to happen is we're both going to go up because instead of saying, I don't like you anymore and I do like that person, what they say is, now I've got two people I like. And boop, now we both have the same backer and everybody goes up.
Yeah, it's not like I'm going to cut my $2 to A to give it to B. You can give $2 to both. It's not going to hurt my finances.
Time and time again, we see both of the Patreon campaigns go up. And it's like, but it's bringing back those old concepts of cross promotion and collaboration that not for nothing over the last decade we just got out of the habit of doing it because social media was delivering on all of those things: discoverability, promotion, publishing. It was delivering on all of that. Now that it's not, we at least for this interim period until something else comes along. We cartoonists have got to go back to the basics, the things that we did in the early 2000s. And a lot of that comes down to cross-promotion.
I see. Yeah. Okay. Well, so where can listeners find out more about you and your comics and your project?
My favorite topic. You can go to evil-inc.com and check out all of my stuff there. That's my hub. And you can see everything I've got going on. You can also go to Spice Rack Comics with an S, spicerackcomics.com, and see all of our comics there, all the different people. You can jump to the different websites there, and you'll see a lot of stuff that is absolutely gorgeous. We were able to build a real good group. I'll just give you a real quick the lineup. It's Bloomin' Fairies, Pixie Tricks, if you're familiar with Giselle Lagasse from Menage a Three and all the Archie comics that she's done. Garth Graham, Lady Valiant, The Commoner, the Evil Inc. After Dark, which is mine, Spying with Lana, which is beautifully drawn, Filthy Figments, which is a whole spectrum of different comics for every different taste, and Ultra Violence, fantastic comics that you're going to absolutely love if you go to Spice Rack Comics. And of course, over on Blue Sky, I think we're Spice Rack Comics over there. If you put us in the search, we'll come right up. But yeah, those are the main places to see. And hopefully, if I've done my job right, you should be able to go to any one of those and find all the rest. If not, I got more work to do.
Yeah. Okay, well, this has been great. It's, you're an ideal interviewee because I don't have to talk very much.
I'm kind of like, I'm at this point, I've been doing this for so long. It's like you say, hello, Brad, and then I talk for an hour.
Just press the button. And
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show, Tim.
Thank you.
This has been absolutely wonderful. I really appreciate it.
Check out Brad Geiger's work at evil-inc.com. Thanks to our patrons for supporting Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and our other podcasts. To join them, go to patreon.com/deconcomics. Patrons get access to podcasts about the early years of The Amazing Spider-Man, Jim Starlin's run on Captain Marvel, and now Silver Age Batman. We're going story by story through the collection Batman in the 50s. But you can only hear these shows if you pledge at least $4 a month. At the $2 level and up, my brother Paul and I discuss Batman 66 in our Bat Bits podcast. Check it out at patreon.com/deconcomics. At deconstructingcomics.com, you can connect to us on X, Facebook, YouTube, and now Blue Sky. Follow the link to shop at Amazon to support the show, and find links to subscribe to the podcast. You can comment on any episode on our site, drop us a line at mail@deconstructingcomics.com, or talk to us. Click the Leave a Voicemail link on the left sidebar of our site. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. Next week, we look at the forthcoming graphic novel, The Murder Next Door. Artist Hugh D'Andrade was 10 years old when his next-door neighbor was mysteriously murdered, and he saw the body. In this book, he discusses the trauma that this caused him, as the experience stuck with him over decades, and he explores the question, if someone else has had a worse experience than mine, does that mean my trauma is less important than theirs? You'll hear my interview with Hugh, and then Jason and I review the book. I think this book is going to get a lot of attention in the new year, so I hope you'll be here next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.